I was running down the street, cutting through the cold autumn air. I was running hard, though I had nowhere to hurry anymore. I had just been told that my grandfather, the only relative I had left in the entire world, had died after an incident. But how could this have happened? He was in the hospital, under the supervision of doctors. Tears ran down my cheeks, and for a moment it seemed to me like I was 8 years again, running to complain to Grandpa about the scraped knee. I closed my eyes so I wouldn't see him applying iodine to the wound. And then I hear, "Well, that's it. You can open your eyes. It's all over." And when I open them, no, it's not over. There he is, my grandfather Ernest, lying on the floor in the hospital room, with his head cracked. The death resulted from a fall and a blow to the temple against the corner of the table. I heard the policeman's voice through my own sobs. Trying to keep myself together, I looked at the table. It's strange, I thought. Grandpa hates mess. But here, pens and paper scattered all over, and a torn book. The police asked me a few formal questions, and then Dr. Jefferson, Grandpa's doctor, threw his coat over me because I had run out of home in a dress and slippers. He strongly recommended that I return home. He was my grandfather's old friend, and we were lucky to get Grandpa into the hospital under his care after, 2 weeks ago, he stopped recognizing me. It was apparent this was the beginning of dementia. Then I took all our savings and took him to the hospital, and only now did I realize there is no money left for the funeral, and no relatives or friends to borrow from. I am an orphan now. Confused, I sat in the hospital foyer. What do I do next? Someone kindly handed me a handkerchief. "Are you okay?" A young man sat down next to me. He was tall and had an attentive look and pronounced cheekbones. He wore an extraordinary aroma, which implied expensive perfume, a mix of flowers and noble tobacco. The stranger's name was Ethan. His mother was also in this hospital. She had the 4th stage of cancer, and the doctor's prognosis was grim. It seemed we both really needed someone to talk to. And so we talked. I told him how my grandfather raised me alone because my mother died giving me birth. My father left her while she was pregnant, and nobody has known nothing about him ever since. Of course, I didn't remember this. Grandpa told me a little. Grandpa and I didn't talk much, but we read a lot. Despite modest means, Grandpa Ernest never economized on my education, and so I studied foreign languages and received a decent preparation for the university. This fall, I enrolled in the first year of my dream law school, and Grandpa was incredibly proud. Ethan and I were so absorbed in the conversation that we didn't notice a few hours pass. He bought me a sandwich from the vending machine and was very attentive. No one had ever been so interested in my life before. One of Ethan's questions made me think, what do I plan to live on in the future? Maybe Grandpa took care of my future? That would allow me to not worry about money at least while I study. And then I remembered. Yes, sure, Grandpa bequeathed me something. I simply didn't know what exactly. Recently, he asked me to bring him a notary. The meeting was supposed to take place tomorrow, right at the hospital. Grandpa said he had written a will and wanted to notarize it before dementia took his mind completely. But what could he have bequeathed to me? All we had was a cheap apartment, Grandpa's worn-out collection of leather shoes and books. But I still reported this to the police. They just shrugged. They had found no will among Grandpa's belongings in his room. However, the examination showed that Grandpa had consumed alcohol that evening. And the news came as a shock. He never drank. Could he have been poisoned? And what had happened to the will? It was as if a veil fell from my eyes. Could Grandpa have been murdered? Alcohol, the mess on the table. Someone was looking for the will, but what was in it? In response to my arguments, the detective just patted me on the shoulder, as if I were a child. And his reassuring words, "It happens with the elderly, and he simply fell," were infuriating. Frustrated, I rushed out of the police department and went to see Dr. Jefferson. It seemed he was the only one who cared about Grandpa. But then, something important came to mind. Seeing me, the doctor gently asked me how I was. Then he apologized and ran off on some urgent matters. When he returned, he asked me not to wait at all, as he had a lot of patients that day and would be free late. But this was important. I had to talk to him. Therefore, I spent a few more hours waiting patiently. Finally, the tired doctor appeared at his office door. But seeing me again, he got nervous. He started gathering his things to go home quickly, saying his wife was feeling unwell. Wait a minute. The doctor had been avoiding me all day. Was he hiding something? I resolutely blocked his way and looked him in the eyes. Jefferson sighed in defeat. The first thing I asked was how it was even possible that Grandpa had drunk alcohol in the hospital. And then I bombarded Mr. Jefferson with arguments that suggested a possible murder of Grandpa. But in response, I only heard, "It's my fault." The evening before the tragedy, Grandpa came to see the doctor. He was very upset and had whiskey with him. The day before, they had a fight. I only caught Grandpa's final shouts at Jefferson, "I will never forgive you for this." And on evening of his death, Grandpa came to make peace, but he already reeked of alcohol. "I didn't take enough care of him." The doctor hid his face in his hands. He said that he refused to drink, took the bottle away, and shamed Grandpa for doing this. Eventually, they reconciled, and Jefferson escorted him to his room. Then he went home where his sick wife was waiting. When it all happened, he wasn't in the hospital. I should have stayed, at least until he fell asleep. Who knew he would decide to go somewhere and fall? The doctor said sadly, handing me a box with Grandpa's belongings. At home, I pondered over what Jefferson had revealed. What if it wasn't true? What if the doctor had secretly drugged my grandfather to make it easier to get rid of him and then staged the whole incident? But why would he need this? What was in that damned will? In the box with Grandpa's belongings, I found a notebook and saw that one of the pages had been torn off. What if I tried to do a thing I'd often do as a child? You take a pencil and shade a clean page with it. And there it was, Grandpa's handwriting. Or rather, an impression from the pen he used on the missing sheet. It was the text of the will my grandfather bequeathed to me. What? An estate covering 320 square meters, valued at 20 million euros, 17 Will Street? What the hell was that supposed to mean? The next morning, I set out to verify the address. Just before leaving, Dr. Jefferson stopped by to retrieve his overcoat. He even gave me a lift part of the way. And there it was. A high-class neighborhood with opulent houses lining pristine streets. I had only seen such things in movies. Having found the right address, I stopped hesitantly at the threshold of a massive red brick mansion with white plasterwork around the windows. For a moment, I thought that woman who opened the door mistook me for a ghost. Her face was so bewildered that I apologized first, but then asked if she happened to know my grandfather, Ernest. I showed her his photo, and her reaction stunned me. She abruptly shut the door and shouted from behind it that she didn't know any grandfathers. Quite a conversation it was. Could I misunderstood the address? My investigation needed a fresh perspective. So I dug up the contact of my new acquaintance from the hospital, Ethan. He drove up to the nearby coffee shop, and I told him about the evidence I had found and how I'd made a fool of myself by coming to a stranger's house. We laughed together, but suddenly he took my hand and looked straight into my eyes. I understand that when you lose someone close, you want to find someone to blame. But what if your grandfather had really made up that mansion? All in all, he wasn't well at all. What if there was actually no reason for anyone to kill him? But wait, there's something more. A blue folder in my grandfather's safe box. It contains some documents I was supposed to bring to him. Ethan suggested we go check it out together. He was skeptical, thinking that the folder was a figment of my grandfather's imagination. And he added that if he was right, I owed him a date. Ethan's sudden kiss on my doorstep made me forget everything for a while. The next thing I knew, he scooped me up in his arms and carried me into the room. For the first time in these long, difficult days, I felt truly happy. In the morning, I woke up to the aroma of coffee and the scent of his cologne on the blanket. Ethan reminded me that it would be good to follow through on our evening plan. My grandfather had never hidden the key to the safe. It usually stuck out from the lock. So in an instant, I held that coveted folder in my hands. However, it was empty. And then it hit me. The doctor. He'd been here recently to retrieve his coat. I asked Ethan to drive me to the hospital. If Jefferson had taken those papers, there was no doubt he was the killer. But what could be in those documents to justify taking someone's life? Maybe the answer lied in the reason behind their quarrel. After bidding farewell to Ethan, I took a decisive step into Dr. Jefferson's office. "Tell me about the fight with my grandfather." I simply needed to piece together all the missing elements of this story. The doctor hesitated first, but then he revealed, "The cause of the fight was your mother, Anna. She's alive and she lives in our city. After I was born, my mother lived a wild lifestyle and drank a lot. My wealthy grandfather blamed himself for spoiling her with money and permissiveness. But it was too late for him to do anything. One day, after she had been away from home for 2 days, leaving 3-year-old me alone without food, my grandfather's patience snapped. He convinced his daughter to relinquish custody in his favor, giving her all his money instead. As such, he took me away, determined not to repeat his past mistakes in raising his granddaughter. All these years, my mother had been elusive. My grandfather shielded me from her, falsely claiming she had died. But when my grandfather ended up in the hospital, Jefferson informed Anna of that. He hoped his old friend could reconcile with his daughter while he was still in his right mind. And she came to see him for the first time in 15 years. But instead of forgiveness, she received a barrage of accusations. Grandpa claimed she showed up because she was broke. And Jefferson? He received a portion of curses for orchestrating that meeting. I didn't know how I was supposed to react to this information. All this time, my mother was right there, but I never knew about it. But what about the contents of that folder? Dr. Jefferson knew that my grandfather had taken the documents related to the property, the mansion in which my mother still resided. "The Will Street estate?" I asked. The doctor nodded. So, for him, the document held no value. However, my mother, armed with it and in the absence of a will in my favor, could easily transfer the inheritance to herself, and I would have never discovered. That woman at the mansion's doorstep, was she really my mother? I had never met her before, but I felt I hated her at that moment. Her true motive for getting rid of my grandfather became obvious. Determined, I decided to retrieve the stolen document. I remembered the story Grandpa had told me once. He'd said he'd lived in another house, now identified, and had a spare key to it hidden in the old bird box on the oak in its yard. I wondered if breaking into my own estate considered a crime. One evening, I waited until Anna left and then climbed the oak. And there, amidst old leaves and feathers, I found it. The key still tucked away in Grandpa's hiding spot. A few minutes later, I was unlocking the house with that key, hoping there were no servants inside. Suddenly, right on the doorstep, I heard a male voice. "Darling, you forgot your phone. I've got it," it said. And then I felt the smell. It was so familiar, like flowers and tobacco. And then out of the room came Ethan. The expression on his face abruptly shifted to disdain. "Well, you're not as foolish as I thought." So it was he who took the papers. And after that night with me, he returned to bed with... What a nightmare. As he realized that I could easily prove the murder now, Ethan lunged at me, grabbing me by the throat. It would have taken him just a moment to slam me against the hall dresser, like he did to my grandfather. But suddenly, someone smashed a vase over his head. Ethan fell, and behind him I saw... my mother. She had returned just in time to get her phone. "Forgive me," she said, and in that word there was more than I ever wanted to hear from her. Perhaps some maternal instinct lingered in her. It's been a month since the investigation into Ethan and my mother began. The mansion now belongs to me. Did I ever dream of this? Honestly, no. Not at such cost. After all those events, I'm not ready to talk to my mother yet. During the investigation, she revealed that upon learning of my grandfather's illness, she truly sought reconciliation. She begged him to finally meet me. But in his fervor, he also promised to remove her from the house. And he called a notary to have the house transferred to me. And sure thing, her lover found out about this. Clearly, he was interested in this inheritance too. So, he killed Grandpa, taking advantage of his intoxicated state. Ethan thought he'd find the papers in the hospital room, but he only found the will. And then he ingratiated himself with me. And about the rest of the story, you already know it. Can I trust people after all that? I'm not sure yet. But now I definitely believe in myself, and that even a nearly orphaned girl can stand up for herself and make criminals answer for their deeds. Grandpa would be proud.